So we're going through it may seem like a lot of really dense information. We've definitely given you the slides. We want this to be a resource to refer back to, but it's just kind of understanding a little bit how these pieces fit together, because you're encountering these terms. You want to definitely, to the client, to the agent you're working with, you want to be able to show that you have some knowledge, but this is an important aspect that we're going to cover next, is the authority. Do you have the right to represent this taxpayer, and how do you go about it? So this is an important aspect to understand, and that's authority. So as we look at authority, we have to say, okay, first of all, let's just look at how all this came about. The IRS has oversight. They kind of have the overriding umbrella. And in fact, the Treasury Department, this may seem crazy, they've had oversight of representatives going way back to 1884. That's when enrolled agents first kind of came into existence. That's a long time ago. They've had the ability to have oversight over representing in front of them for a long, long time. In fact, Circular 230 came about way back in 1921. That was modeled after the ABA model rules of professional conduct. So those of us enrolled agents or CPAs or whatever say, oh, we don't have to follow, rules like attorneys do. It got its first, start back from the ABA rules of professional conduct. It is, what is practice really? It is all matters connected with presenting stuff to the IRS. It relates to taxpayer rights and privileges or their liabilities. It's under the laws and regulations administered by the IRS. So they have this big duty to administer it. But what exactly is presentation? I mean, what are these things? Have you ever prepared or filed documents? Have you ever written something corresponding or communicating with the IRS? What about rendering written advice to a client? Those are all considered a form of representation. It's all understanding this is all within their jurisdiction. We definitely think of, representing a taxpayer at a conference or hearing or meeting. Well, yeah, that's representation. But be aware those other things can kind of fall within that umbrella as well if you're just preparing documents. Here's the one thing is anyone actually, you don't have to be a representative or be under these rules. Anyone can prepare a return as long as they're not being paid, or they can furnish information if the IRS says, hey, I want some information on this taxpayer, or appear as a witness. But if you're being paid for preparing a return, you are under their umbrella, you could say. So thinking of that, well, let's go into another area. What is confidentiality? We have to be a little careful. We do have some privilege. We have limited privilege as a representative, and we can protect some communications that exists luckily between the taxpayer and a federally authorized tax practitioner. So what is a federally authorized tax practitioner? Under IRC 7525, again, we're going back to the attorneys, the CPAs, the enrolled agents. We have a lot of power. We have a lot of authority. We have this real cool thing called, well, it's limited, but called privilege. But privilege does not extend to, and it doesn't apply to tax preparation. If you're preparing a tax return, they can make you fess up to things you find out while you're preparing a return. It's just in representation. You can't really use it outside of dealings with IRS either. You can't say, oh, I have confidentiality and you're trying to help a person in, let's say, a court matter or, a criminal matter. Definitely not. It just applies to communications that could be privileged if it was between an attorney and a taxpayer, and only non-criminal matters. Here's what happens if suddenly you go, what I was mentioning before, into the criminal investigative unit. Your privilege disintegrates like fine powder and dust in the wind. You no longer have privilege once it turns criminal. So those are some little things to understand. We understand we're kind of under the authority of the IRS when we do these things for taxpayers. We understand we could have some privilege, but we got to be careful on our side that we're watching for conflict of interest. So what exactly, if we're talking about conflict of interest, we can refer back to Circular 230, references it specifically under Section 10.29. So we understand conflict of interest is that we can't represent a client if it involves a conflict of interest. Okay, so what is that? What is a conflict of interest? It's where one client's interest is at war or kind of adverse to another's. The simplest thing to think of that is if you help someone, it harms someone else. That is a conflict of interest. But what are we looking at as who are these ones that may affect us? And sometimes they might fall outside of our radar if we're not paying attention to this. If you have a risk of representing a client or responsibility to because of a responsibility to another client, or here's the catchy one, a former client. What if helping this client harms a former client you used to have? That's still a conflict of interest. What if it harms a third person? Or what if it affects the personal interests of you as the practitioner? So here's a touchy area. What about an exam? You prepared the return. Now it's being examined. If you represent that taxpayer, could you be worried about at some point now you're going to have to be faced with a potential preparer penalty? And does that harm the taxpayer because you're going to watch out for your own interests instead of theirs? So these, this is a tough area when we look about ethics and stuff, but it's just kind of saying, hey, you got to understand this is out there. We got to make sure to pay attention to it. But what if a revenue agent threatens a preparer penalty or OPR? You're subject to this potential sanction. Well, you have just been put in an immediate conflict with your client. So there's some things you just have to know and just watch on your radar. Now, you are able to go ahead and represent the client as long as you think that you have a reasonable belief that you can provide good representation to each of those affected clients, and it's somewhere else legally prohibited already. And each affected client has to waive their conflict by giving informed consent. Informed means they understand, and they have to do this from the time the conflict is known, or at least within 30 days, that, hey, by the way, here's, maybe it's a former client. I used to help so-and-so. I think that if I represent you, it could harm a potential interest to them. Are you okay with me going forward? I think I can still do that fairly, but so you have to give them informed consent, and they have to sign off on it. Otherwise, you cannot help them. You also have to retain the consent for at least 3 years after the engagement and provide that if the IRS happens to request that information. So this is how it works for conflict of interest. So it's understanding a little bit bigger world. Yeah, we have some power, we have some authority. We can say, I have some privilege in what you tell me. I can keep it confidential, but I also have to watch for conflict of interest to make sure I'm truly representing you fairly. So these are all one of the things we need to understand when we talk about authority in general. We also have to look at what is something called a central authorized file. We may hear this term, the CAF, we call it CAF, CAF. It means central authorized file. Well, this actually contains information regarding someone's authorization. When a taxpayer gives a representative authorization, it's held in this little file called a CAF. You get a CAF number the moment you send your very first power of attorney or tax information authorization form, 2848 or 8821 respectively. What you do is just write none in the CAF number box, and then they will go ahead and assign you one. Now, maybe you know that you've had one in the past, but you just can't remember what it is. You don't want to have duplicate CAF numbers. So you can call the Practitioner Priority Service, and they can help you to locate that CAF number. But, okay, now I understand I need, to send this power of attorney or a form. Where do I send it to? There's 2 places to process it. And remember, this can change without notice as they decide to. Generally speaking, west of the Mississippi, you send to Ogden, and in the East Coast, you process in Memphis. But we've included a link here just so you can go ahead and check out where you're at. So where do you send these forms to, and where is that CAF unit? Now, the CAF unit normally you can fax to or you can mail to. You don't ever get the opportunity to call them. So it is the way that works. Philadelphia is another one, but that's like more for international. So you may hear of that, and it's not that we're not telling you about it. It's just that the main 2 are in Memphis and Ogden. So we'll talk a little bit about some specific forms here. We have a Form 8821, and that is Tax Information Authorization. We'll refer to it as TIA quite often. This allows you as an individual, or get this, your organization, your business can have a CAF number, and it can get information on behalf of a taxpayer. You can receive or inspect information, but does not allow you to actually act on behalf of the taxpayer. You can't represent them, you just get information. It's just like it sounds, tax information authorization. That's all you do. But it can be useful to pull transcripts to assess a situation prior to taking them on as a client. Maybe you want to see what's going on before you sign that power of attorney and be connected to them at the hip. So here's one thing that it can be a tool in your toolbox. There is more instructions there if you wish to, find out a little bit more about it, but it is, hey, this is one tool. We can get information, then we can maybe proceed to the next step if we wish to. So what is that next step? What is that next level up? It's a power of attorney form, Form 2848. The power of attorney form allows an individual to act on behalf of a taxpayer. We refer to it as standing in their place. As long as that authorization isn't limited, they can do all kinds of things. They might be able to, of course, look at information. They can represent them. They can record an interview with the IRS. They can sign things like consents and waivers and closing agreements. The power of attorney truly lets a person really stand in a taxpayer's place. We do have to do a separate power of attorney now for joint filers. We used to have them on the same form, but now you have to do a separate power of attorney for every single taxpayer or business. Each one has to give you authorization independently. And there is a checkbox if you want a copy of communications. There's a little box next to the representative names. Now, you can have multiple representatives on a power of attorney, but this is just like a little side note that if you have, let's say, 3 representatives on the power of attorney, only the first 2, the order of the first 2 make a difference because only the first 2 receive communication. So that's just a little FYI as you're filling out a power of attorney on how that works. As far as the time frame, you have to designate, what time frame am I going to put on here? I want power to help with, let's say, income tax for various years. You can't say all future years, or you can't say all years. You have to be specific. So I might say 1990 through 2021. You can go 3 years into the future of the current year, but you have to be specific. The next thing you have to do is be specific about the tax matter, or they won't be able to discuss it. You have to say like income tax, or you can describe specifically what you're pertaining to. You might say civil penalty, separate assessment, employment tax. Whatever that tax matter is, you've got to be specific in order to have the authority. There's also a new item that's occurred actually just as of 2018, and that is something called the Intermediate Service Provider Checkbox, which sounds like a lot of words. It simply allows you permission to access IRS transcripts or records through a commercial software company like Canopy. You got to make sure you check that box if you're doing so, but that's for all new power of attorneys in effect. If you already have one, let's say from 2017 that's listed in the CAF, you don't have to go through and redo them. But if you, for some reason, have to change that up and redo it, then you would have to worry about the checkbox on there. So that's a new thing that we are working with this year. And again, if you want more instructions, they're all contained within the 2848 form. There's a lot of great detail there as well.